IDF. With that, I'm going to hand it over to Elana. It's so good to see you, Elana.
Thanks. It is great to be with all of you. I know we can't be in person, but I am going to try to make you feel my presence through the screen. And anybody who is on video, I'm going to try to feel your presence through the screen, and we're going to do the best that we can. I think we have a very serious challenge on our hands. We're talking about cognitive dissonance and our political and social alliances. Let's talk about the challenge a little bit. So, there's a huge challenge for Jews, the majority of American Jews, I can say, who are liberal to progressive in their politics. And they're feeling more and more uncomfortable or crowded out in spaces that they once felt very comfortable in because of anti-Zionism, non-Zionism, anti-Semitism. So there's a big cognitive dissonance. How do I deal with trying to live out my values and also trying to live out my values? Trying to live out my values of, I don't know, you name it, equality, equity, taking care of the poor, anti-racism. How can I live out those values even as it seems like some of the other values that I have, self-preservation, support for the state of Israel, seem to be at odds with each other in those spaces, sometimes to the point of me getting kicked out of them. On the other side, we have people who skew conservative. And people who skew conservative, it's one thing for them to be Republicans. But in Trump's America, skewing conservative, you're now being asked to align yourself with anti-democratic policies, to align yourself with lack of due process, to align yourself with arresting a 6-year-old who has leukemia in immigration court. How are you supposed to live your values and also live your values? And at the same time, there's plenty of anti-Semitism coming from the right. And some of these rules, these more draconian anti-democratic measures that are being taken in the name of protecting Jews, thus also raising anti-Semitism. So we have a big problem. We have what's called a dilemma. A dilemma is where you actually don't have a right answer. You have two insufficient answers, two unsatisfactory answers. And so what I want to do with you today, this morning, tonight, depending on where you are, is I want to talk about how we deal with a moment like this. And no surprises, this is what I'm going to do. The first thing I'm going to do is I want to remind us of some very unusual alliances, shocking alliances even, from the 20th century, in moments where people felt we need to do this now. Despite the cognitive dissonance, despite the problems, despite what I might call the dirty hands problem, which we'll get back to soon, we have to do it anyway. I just want to do that because it'll shake us a little bit out of our polarization and the imagination that you can be on a team and stay on that team and you can have everything on that team. Second thing I want to do is I want to talk about transactional allyship or transactional alliances. And I'll explain what I mean by transactional alliances, but put quite simply, I'm talking about alliances that are not forever alliances. They're not permanent. They don't indicate that we share every value. In fact, I might make such an alliance for the purpose of utility with someone with whom I share almost no values, but I share some perceived end and maybe some values. And the third thing I want to do is I want to talk about what happens when we actually decide to invest in transactional alliances. Are there limits? What are the ethics of that? What should we be looking out for? Because to be honest, I think that where we are now, and I'm talking in America, I know, Jan, I saw you. I know not only Americans are on here, and I know Canadians are on here too. And you have your own version of this, but I can speak to the American version of this. I think we are going to have to make many transactional alliances, both on the left and on the right. On the left, to keep democracy safe, and sometimes to try to engage the anti-Semitism problem. And on the right, to keep Israel safe and to engage the anti-Semitism problem. And I don't think that transactional alliances are ugly or dirty or wrong. I just think there's something we're not used to at this point in time. And I think we need to get used to them again. So just to scare you, let's start with part one. Part one is the crazy, wacky alliances of the 20th century. I'm going to start with such a softball. You ready for the softball? The softball is the way that the Lubavitcher Rebbe of blessed memory spoke about President Jimmy Carter. Okay, this is easy. It's a lob. It's a layup. Now, just to give us a sense, Jimmy Carter, as a Democrat, I don't know how the Lubavitcher Rebbe, defined himself in terms of being a Democrat or a Republican. I have guesses, but I don't know. But I do know that he deeply appreciated Jimmy Carter's interest in education. And in fact, Jimmy Carter proclaimed the Rebbe's birthday as like a day of education, a national day of education. And I also know that the Lubavitcher Rebbe really, really disliked the Camp David Accords between Begin and Sadat, really disliked the peace treaty with Egypt, thought that Israel had to concede too much, thought it was a complete failure. I think it's really important to know that I, as someone who grew up in an Orthodox home, to my education and upbringing, I just want you to understand, to my education and upbringing, Jimmy Carter was the worst. He was the worst. I'm not talking about he was somebody who we didn't agree. He was the worst. I knew who Jimmy Carter was at the age of 5. Really, I really, really did. So I want you to see what the Lubavitcher Rebbe writes when Jimmy Carter loses the election. Okay. Now I want to just make sure that I do this in a nice way. 1 second. View. Sorry, everybody. Okay. So let's take a look. He writes, January 15th, 1981. Appreciation is not full endorsement. That's what I'm calling it. But such is not the way of the Torah. Notwithstanding any past mistakes, Torah bids us to be grateful, to acknowledge those good things which were done. In the eyes of Torah, to be an ingrate is a despicable thing, unworthy of any decent human being. And in the past administration, the outstanding achievement was the prevention of war. There were instances in the past 4 years, but for the endeavors of the president, could have easily led to war. Not only did he thus save millions of Americans from the horrors of such consequence, but in all probability, the rest of the world. And for this, he deserves our thanks and gratitude. Now, he also makes sure to say, a short note of caution is in order here. The above acknowledgement is in no way to be construed as a retraction from my previous stand concerning the Camp David Accords. I reiterate as strongly as possible that it was and remains a disaster and peril for Jews and the rest of the world. The president's part in the accords was, no doubt, motivated by the hope that it would bring peace, and for this he is to be commended. But the fact remains that all that has been achieved is that one side has made numerous concessions, including giving up land and essential oil supplies, for no substantive return whatsoever. Such concessions merely prompt demands for further concessions, creating an even greater danger to peace. You get it. Essentially, what he's trying to do is show, look at this. I can appreciate someone without fully endorsing everything that they believe or stand for. Now, that to me is such a tame example because he looked at Jimmy Carter and he saw basically a good guy who he disagreed with about a pretty major policy issue and agreed with on other major policy issues. I also think it's interesting that he describes how Jimmy Carter did good for the United States, even as he disagreed with what he was doing vis-a-vis Israel. But I want to go to a tougher one, because when you live through being in a bunker, as we have for these last couple of weeks and also this year, you try to find, things that make you feel better about your situation. And I'll tell you what I have found. I found the story of Winston Churchill. I think the story of Winston Churchill is absolutely fascinating. There was the bombing of London lasted 57 days every night. They didn't have the same kinds of bomb shelters. They certainly didn't have anti-missile defenses, and people got through it. But what I think is fascinating, and we don't talk about enough, is the absolutely crazy thing that Winston Churchill did. He allied himself with Stalin, a murderer, a mass murderer. He allied himself with Stalin in order to beat the Nazis. And in his Churchillian way, had an incredible line about it. He said, if Hitler invaded hell, I would make at least a favorable reference to the devil in the House of Commons. Sounds a bit Machiavellian, but to be clear, the way that Churchill explains it is Hitler wishes to destroy the Russian power because he hopes that if he succeeds in this, he will be able to bring back the main strength of his army and air force from the east and hurl it upon this island, meaning Great Britain, which he knows he must conquer or suffer the penalty of his crimes. His invasion of Russia is no more than a prelude to an attempted invasion of the British Isles. And so Churchill, in 1941, after the Nazis invade the Soviet Union, gets into an alliance with Stalin that continues. Now, when I see that alliance, I am taken aback in a very big way. Obviously, we're talking about a situation of supreme emergency. Very different than the Schneerson example, but nonetheless a reminder that there are times where seriously transactional allyship is what we are looking for, not ideological sameness, but simply being able to do something together. The third example I want to give you, and we could spend the whole time just going back and forth and having a dilemma conversation about each of these, but I think they're important because they break us out of certain assumptions. The Ha'avara agreement between the Nazis and the Jewish Agency in the 1930s. A man by the name of Sam Cohen from Austria, a businessman, realized that Jews were not emigrating from Germany because they weren't allowed to take their possessions with them. And so he struck a deal with the Nazis, and eventually the Jewish Agency actually came on board with this deal that essentially the Nazis would let Jews leave, hold their money and possessions, at least some, in escrow. And when the Jews got to Palestine, they would be able to use that money to buy German goods. So essentially, instead of boycotting the growing Third Reich from 1933 to 1938, about 60,000 German Jews made their way to Palestine and were saved from the Holocaust. But they were saved from the Holocaust because they broke the boycott against the Third Reich, which means they provided the Third Reich with economic backing. And how that impacted other Jews and how that impacted the world is something that is very hard to measure and very disturbing to think about. I also want to say that his wife, Anita Mueller Cohen, was against this plan. She thought it was a deal with the devil, which is what the picture right here shows you. It's actually the name of an Israeli film that was made, A Deal with the Devil, quote unquote, a question mark, Jose im Hasatan. And apparently there are letters going back and forth, though I haven't been able to procure them yet, where she says to him, please stop this foolishness. You can't do this. We all have to boycott the Nazis. Her family did not take advantage of the Havara agreement, of the transfer agreement, and all but one were killed in the Holocaust. So there you have it, a third example where we are not talking about America versus Israel. We are not talking about the threat of communism versus the threat of Nazism. We are talking about saving these Jews now and contributing money to a government that is going to hurt these other Jews later. Holy cow. Yes, the world, life is full of difficult choices. I do not think that we have the luxury at this moment in at least American Jewish history, perhaps Western Jewish history, to suggest that we are going to be able to only make alliances with people with whom we fully line up. And I mean that both on the left and on the right. And so what I'd like to do is I'd like to spend a little bit of time talking about what I would term transactional alliances. And I'm going to show you what I mean by transactional alliances. And rest assured, I don't think that transactional alliances are a get out of jail free card and you can do anything at any time. But once we actually start talking about transactional alliances, honestly, we can start figuring out the ethics of this. And I also want to say, and this is somewhat of a promo because I do care about this topic, we're going to be launching a mini series of texting on this topic where I speak to practitioners from different parts of the Jewish community about these issues and how they're actually playing out. Because to me, this is the issue of our moment, most literally. So let's talk about transactional alliances. Okay, they don't all have to be as crazy as the second and third example that I gave you, but it should push us out of our lethargy. So in Pirkei Avot, in Ethics of the Great Ones, we have a statement by Rabbi Yoshua ben Prachya and Mitai Ha'arbeli. The two of them say, or really Yoshua ben Pracha, Omer, he says, Aseh lecha rav, you should make for yourself a teacher. Uknei lecha chaver, you should make for yourself a friend. Maybe you should acquire a friend. Ve'vedan et kol adam l'kaf zechut. And you should give everyone the benefit of the doubt. Now, when I see these three, what I see is sort of concentric circles of influence, with the tightest circle, because remember, Pirkei Avot is actually a work about being a student. It's the rabbinic tradition starting, essentially. Your greatest influence is your teacher, is your rabbi. Your next influence is your friend or your friends, and the next influence is the large sphere around you. That's how I see it. But the truth is that Maimonides chooses to quote on this, he chooses to quote Aristotle. And he chooses to quote Aristotle about different types of friendship. And to me, these different types of friendship help me think about alliances right now. There are accordingly, and I'm giving you the original Aristotle, three kinds of friendship. Friends whose affection is based on utility do not love each other in themselves, but insofar as some benefit accrues to them from each other. And similarly with those whose friendship is based on pleasure. For instance, we enjoy the society of witty people, not because of what they are in themselves, but because they're agreeable to us. In other words, both of these kinds of friendships focus on what do I get out of this, not do I love you, okay? Do I share every virtue and value with you? What do I get out of this? Hence, in a friendship based on utility or on pleasure, people love their friend for their own good or for their own pleasure, and not as being the person loved, but as useful or agreeable. Friendships of these kinds are easily broken off in the event of the parties themselves changing. For if no longer pleasant or useful to each other, they cease to love each other. And utility is not a permanent quality. It differs at different times. Hence, when the motive of the friendship has passed away, the friendship itself is dissolved, having existed merely as a means to an end. Essentially, friendships of utility and pleasure are friendships that are not meant to be permanent. They are meant to get a job done. The third type of friendship, which is actually what Maimonides thinks is being spoken about in the Mishnah in Pirkei Avot, the perfect form of friendship is that between the good, those who resemble each other in virtue. For these friends wish each alike the other's good in respect of their goodness, and they are good in themselves. But it is those who wish the good of their friends for their friends' sake, who are friends in the fullest sense, since they love each other for themselves and not accidentally. Hence, the friendship of these lasts as long as they continue to be good, and virtue is a permanent quality. Friendships, therefore, based on pleasure and on utility can exist between two bad people, between one bad person and one good, between a person neither good or bad, and another either good or bad, or neither. But clearly, only good people can be friends for what they are in themselves, since bad people do not take pleasure in each other, save as they get some advantage from each other. Now, I think that as Jewish communities, we made the mistake of thinking that friendships of utility, that alliances of utility were the third category, which is that they were full virtue joining. There are two problems with this. Number one, we are now in a moment where even those with whom you had an alliance of virtue, where you do agree on some values, you do believe that you share good values, there are other good values that those allies reject, including a relationship with the state of Israel, including support of the Jewish people and support of Jewish peoplehood. And so what's happened is people have said, well, you're of no utility to me anymore. And so my question is, when I see that, I say, how do we rebuild? What do we rebuild? And I have two answers. I'm going to be frank. I think the best answer is to try to remind those people who saw virtue in you before that you're still virtuous. They just think differently than you do. And you actually, if they know who you are and they've known who you are, they should actually trust you to hear you and to be able to welcome you in. I don't think we should abandon that. I don't think we should abandon that at all. But I do think that alongside that, there has to be a pragmatism where there are going to be utilitarian alliances, left and right, utilitarian alliances that are going to get us things that we need. Things that we need, like saving democracy, things that we need, like protecting Israel. And those are going to go in different directions. There's going to be a sense of imperfect belonging. That third category sounded like it was perfect belonging. There's going to be a sense of imperfect belonging. Now, my question is, what are the ethics of this? And I mentioned, I think it's actually important to talk about the very practical steps, which is what I'm going to be doing on the podcast with people who are practitioners and experiencing this now. But I want to give us 2 rules of thumb for transactional alliances. One, if we are making an alliance, and I'm actually going to talk about the right now. I hope that's okay. And we can apply it to the left later. If I am making a transactional alliance with someone on the right with whom I do not share most values, I have to remember that I still do not share most of those values. I cannot fall into a place where I believe the hype and I think that being an ally means complete fealty and loyalty. And to the second, if there are things about that ally that I find dangerous and problematic, that I find that I might even be enabling in some way, then I need to figure out a way, A, to acknowledge that my hands are dirty, and B, to do something about it. It would look akin to lobbying an ally while also resisting some of their bad policies. It would be akin to backroom politicking, but front room protesting. It would be akin to the ability to try to set up NGOs or work with NGOs to work against some of those policies, even as you may feel stuck in some ways in an alliance. Now, I'm going to give my own example. You do not have to agree with me in any way, shape, or form, okay? My own example. I wanted to rank Governor Cuomo in the New York race, even though he is a sexual harasser, even though he is a bully. I know all of those things. I wanted to do it anyway because I think the stakes are too high not to be transactional on this one. I think the stakes are too high not to be transactional on this one. I can't just do that and just throw my hands up and say, well, it is what it is. I actually have to get involved with some of the problems that he would pose to New York, to people, to women. I actually have to get involved in some way, if not directly with what he does, perhaps in some other way, right? But the hands are dirty. The hands are dirty, and pretending the hands are not dirty is a major problem because it actually makes people more likely to be complacent about those alliances and to turn into those values and to start glomming onto those values that they otherwise thought were anathema. Okay. I want to give an example on the left. Okay. Same race. Again, you don't have to like what I say. Okay. We just have to be able to have a conversation. And isn't it easy when we're having a conversation when I'm talking and you're listening? It's like, it's exactly what I do with my kids. I just say, and then, so I want to talk about the same race. I completely understand why a progressive like Brad Lander would want to co-endorse Mamdani. I completely understand it. That is actually an engagement of values. That is not transactional. It's an engagement of values. I am also very upset about it because I think it leaves in the dust the value of protecting Israel. I think it leaves in the dust the value of stemming anti-Semitism. And so here I'm looking at somebody who is making a decision based on a good portion of their values. And I'm saying, but you're not covering a value that I think is more important. And so I'm willing to be transactional and go for the other guy because I think that value is more important. And I understand that people will disagree with me, but I just have to give the other example. Now, where are places where I would actually engage? Well, if I'm going to a rally that's pro-immigration, that's pro-immigrant, I'm sure there's going to be some, Palestine, kafia. I'm sure there's going to be plenty of that. I'm still going to go to that rally because I don't see myself strengthening somebody else's ability to be having a hold over the coffers of New York. I don't see myself as strengthening. And so I'm willing to be somewhat transactionally engaged with that group because there are things that we actually share and there's a utility that we're trying to get to, right? Again, people might disagree with me and say, I'm just not showing up. It was the same thing with the Black Lives Matter protests. Again, I want to remind us, I am not saying that we should abandon the possibility of helping people understand who we are and why we're valuable and why we should be part of things. But I am saying I do think we need to consider where we make alliances and which alliances we're willing to say, I'm going to bat for this person if it's actually going to strengthen things that are against our values, and where we're basically saying, I can't go to bat for this person, even though they share some of my values, because there are some of my values that they don't. Where we're going to be willing to make a transactional alliance, but make sure we don't turn into the person, and where those transactional alliances, where we say it's actually worth it, even though it might be problematic for some of my values, but I'm choosing to fight the Nazis over fighting the Soviets. I'm serious. I don't mean literally to compare anybody to the Nazis or the Soviets right now. I mean, I'm choosing the bigger problem right now. And my hands are dirty, and there's something I need to do in order to try to compensate to the degree that I can. So let's look at some Torah that I think actually bears this out. So the first is there's this remarkable Talmudic passage in Avodah Zarah, in the Babylonian Talmud. And Avodah Zarah, even though it means idolatry, what it's really trying to do is it's trying to figure out relationships between Jews and Gentiles in a pagan world. And it goes something like this. Antoninus, who people think was the Emperor Caracalla of Rome, and Rabbi Judah the Prince, who is a mainstay of the rabbinic tradition, the editor of the Mishnah, and a very wealthy liaison of the Jewish community, they have a relationship. Antoninus once said to Rebbe, that's what I'm going to call him because that's how he's called, it is my desire that my son Asverus should reign, instead of me, meaning after me, should be dynastic, and that Tiberias should be declared a colony. Okay, Tiberias was a Jewish settlement. Declaring a place a colony means they're not going to have heavy taxes. So Antoninus basically says, I have two things that I want. One is for me. I want my kid to reign after me. And another is for the Jews. I want to help Tiberius not be tax-free. Were I to ask one of these things, it would be granted. Meaning if I asked my Senate to do one of these, I would get it. While both would not be granted. So he's essentially asking Rebbe, a representative of the Jews, help me decide what to do. So Rebbe does something clever. He brought a man, and having made him ride on the shoulders of another man, he hands a dove to the man, and he basically says to the guy who's holding him on the shoulders and says, go tell him to let the dove go, right? So you have a person on top of another person. The person on the top is holding a dove, and the person on the bottom is told, tell the guy up top to let the dove go. The emperor perceived this to mean that he was advised to ask of the Senate to appoint his son Asverus or Severus, as we know him in history, to reign in his stead, and that subsequently he might get Severus to make Tiberius a free colony. Meaning, great, it's good for Antoninus, it's good for the Jews. Perfect, he found the right way. So sounds great. Sounds great that Rebbe has this kind of access to Antoninus. He can help the Jews. This is fantastic. Except that as things go on, you see there is a real problem here. This Antoninus is dangerous. Antoninus had a cave which led from his house to the house of Rebbe, meaning he doesn't want anyone to know publicly that they have a relationship. Every time he visited Rebbe, he brought two slaves, one of whom he killed at the door of Rebbe's house so that nobody would know. And the other, who had been left behind, would be killed at the door of his own house when he came home. So he's a murderer. Rebbe is now allying himself with a murderer. Said Antoninus to Rebbe, when I come to you, I don't want anyone to be here. But guess what? One day, he finds Rabbi Chanina ben Chama, sitting there with Rebbe. So Antoninus says, didn't I tell you no one is supposed to be here when I come? Rebbe says, no, this isn't an ordinary human being. So Antoninus says, okay, if he's not ordinary, let him tell that servant who's sleeping, which we know the person's dead, they're not sleeping, who's sleeping outside the door to rise and come in, right? If this isn't a human being, I'm sure they can do miracles. Rabbi Chanina bar Chama then went out, but found that the man was dead. He said, how shall I act now? Shall I call and say, one second, I just have to get to the next one, that the man is dead, but one shouldn't bring a sad report, meaning it's not a good idea to bring that report back to the emperor. Should I leave him and walk away? That would be slighting the king. So he prayed for mercy for the man, and he was restored to life. He then sent him in. Antoninus said, "Oh, I'm well aware that the least one among you Jews can bring the dead to life, but still, when I come, I don't want anyone to be found here." So one would think that in this moment of Antoninus essentially proving himself to both be a murderer and also endanger other Jews' lives, that Rabbi would say, you know what, we're going to hold off on this relationship. But instead, it actually gets more intensive. Every time he called, of course, this is in some ways the Gemara, the Talmud, imagining what it would be like for the king of Rome to be at the beck and call of the editor of the Mishnah. Every time Antoninus called, meaning he came, Antoninus would attend to Rebbe and wait on him with food and drink. When Rebbe wanted to get to his bed, Antoninus crouched in front of it, saying, "You can get onto your bed by stepping on me." Rebbe, however, said, "No, that's not proper to treat a king so slightingly." And Antoninus says, "No, I wish I could serve as a mattress for you in the world to come," meaning I'm not worth, you're treading on. And once he asks Rebbe, "Will I enter the world to come?" Now, I want you to think about what you would have answered to Antoninus. I mean, if I have that good of a relationship with him, maybe I would have said, "You'll enter the world to come if you do good. You'll enter it." But he's a murderer. And instead, Rebbe just says, "Yes." And then Antoninus says, "But isn't it written, there shall be no remnant to the house of Asaph?" So he says, no, that applies only to people whose deeds are evil, like those of Asaph. In other words, he placates him. He placates him. He doesn't encourage him to do better. He doesn't say, maybe you should stop killing the guard at the door every time. None of that. Doesn't use the opportunity at all to offer any resistance to this man's corrupt ways. And the story between the two of them ends with a famous citation of God saying to Rebekah about Esau, who represents Rome in rabbinic thought, and Jacob, who represents the Jewish people in rabbinic thought. The Lord said to Rivkah, "Two nations, two goyim are in your womb." Said Rabbi Judah in the name of Rav, don't read it as two goyim, two nations, but two geim, two lords, two proud people. Who are these twinsy proud people? This refers to Antoninus and Rebbe, from whose table neither lettuce, nor radish, nor cucumber was ever absent, either in summer or winter. What started as a way to help the Jews get difficult taxes lifted from them ends with a little bit too chummy of a relationship between Rebbe and Antoninus, and it becomes about the power of their relationship. And Rebbe is Antoninus's friend, doesn't challenge him, tells him he's going to get the world to come, even though he's a murderer. And it's essentially, they're two peas in a pod. To me, when we start thinking about transactional alliances, a transactional alliance means we never become two peas in a pod. We never believe the hype of the way that a person describes themselves. A movement describes itself. We do not fall into anti-Zionism simply because we are working with people on pro-democracy work. We do not become it. I do not become a Trumpist because I support what Trump did for Israel with Iran. We have to be able to draw a line, but not to forget that alliances are political, they are transactional, and they are necessary. So the question is, what about the fact that your hands are getting dirty? They are getting dirty. So I tried to give examples. The two examples that I tried to give, one was I think that if I'm going to rank somebody who I think is actually the bully candidate, the corrupt candidate, but I'm doing it for the sake of the safety of the Jewish people and the state of Israel, I need to recognize that my hands are actually dirty. And I think likewise, if I'm going to be involved in progressive politics, I need to recognize where I might be strengthening anti-Zionism, right? Now, I would make the argument to you, I would always choose the former over the latter, right? I would always choose focusing on kinship ethics and making sure that the Jews are safe and that Israel is safe and being willing to do transactional politics for that than I would over other issues. But I understand that people are going to be transactional over a lot of issues, right? Important issues. But I think we have to recognize that hands get dirty. And only if we recognize that hands get dirty can we actually decide, well, do I want to sully my hands like this? Am I sure I can sully my hands like this? And if I do, is there any other way to make up for how it is that I am dirtying my hands, right? That it doesn't just let me free. And for that, I actually want to turn to a concept in Jewish law called Averah Lishma, doing a sin for its own sake, meaning for the sake of something good. And the example that's given is actually the famous example of Yael in her tent. When Sisra, the foreign officer, comes, she sleeps with him. She's a married woman. She sleeps with him in order to save the Jewish people because she gets him drunk and she kills him, right? Now, I think it's important to recognize that doesn't mean that you're scot-free, that everything was fine. In fact, when we look at how some people describe the discussion of Averah Lishma, it goes like this. At any rate, people need atonement. Even if they do a sin for a good reason, even if, as Michael Walzer, the theorist, would say, you get your hands dirty, you actually need atonement for that dirtying of the hands. Even Elijah at Mount Carmel, the fact that he was forced to run out of fear from Queen Jezebel, another example, was atonement for his having sacrificed on the altar outside of the tabernacle, even though he did so based on God's word. Meaning it's an example of where he had to do something. That something was the lesser of two evils, but it still wasn't good. It still was a problem. And he paid a price for it. And he had to pay a price for it. And to me, this brings me back to what are the things that we prioritize for which we are willing to make transactional alliances? When we make transactional alliances, how do we make sure that we don't fall into the values that we disagree with in those alliances? And I would say the third is, how do we figure out what our limitations are? I'll tell you, in this last election, I didn't vote for Trump. I couldn't vote for Trump, even though I think he was the better candidate for Israel. Disagree with me all you want. That's fine, right? I'm sitting in Jerusalem. That gives me a little something that I'm allowed to do. But I couldn't vote for him because I think his danger is too much and the danger to Israel wasn't enough with the other candidate. Meaning I was trying to figure out, have I hit my limit? But at no point did I pretend that politics is a place of absolute purity tests. It's not possible. It's just not possible. The last thing that I want to say is, I think the majority of American Jewry do not have such a hard time making alliances with the left, even though they're uncomfortable, even though, sometimes it feels like the intersectionality is getting in the way. I think people have a much harder time making alliances on the right. I'm talking about in broad strokes. And I actually really, really, really want to make a case here that I think, depending on what you think the threat is to the Jewish people, whether in your country or in Israel, I think we have to consider seriously what it looks like to have transactional alliances on the right. And I would say the same to people who say, oh, the Democratic Party is becoming a totally anti. I would say to them, you have to figure out a way to have transactional alliances on that side too. But that's not the majority of American Jewry, right? And so I want to remind us of something that, again, you may not like. I keep just saying you may not like, but this is where we are. It's just where we are. I want to remind you of something that I think was put brilliantly by Trude Weiss Rosemarin. She was an activist, a writer, a politician, the founder of The Spectator in 1939. She was the editor of it for 50 years. She has this incredible piece, which I typoed, America, not American. America is not Babylonia. And what she essentially talks about is she talks about how at home Americans feel, American Jews feel. She says a lot of people want to compare American Judaism to Babylonian Judaism, right? Babylonia, we were in diaspora and we got a lot of good done. We did a lot of good. And she says, I don't think they're similar at all. And the reason why is, she says, it's because of self-perception. In attempting an analogy, between American Jewry and Jewish groups of the past, the Jewries of Babylonia, of Muslim Spain, and Eastern Europe do not satisfy the standards of resemblance and likeness on which such a comparison must be based. Why? Because those Jewries never attained full and equal citizenship. They never regarded themselves or were regarded as part and parcel of the body politic of their respective countries. They were strangers in strange lands. Indeed, they prayed for the welfare of the countries that sheltered them, but they did not love them as their own countries. They did not love the countries of their sojourn as the American Jew loves with all their heart and all their soul their cherished country, America. There is then no resemblance at all between American Jewry and the centers of Jewish gravity of the past. But there is a close resemblance between American Jewry and Alexandrian Jewry. We're talking about time of Philo, long time ago, 2,000 years ago. And also German Jewry of the post-Mendelssohnian period. Like American Jewry, which is not merely in America, but fully part of America, Alexandrian Jewry and German Jewry were unreservedly integrated with their respective majority groups and their cultures. And she makes a different point based on this, but I want to make the following point. I think the more we feel like Americans, the harder it is to think about what is worth a transactional alliance. I think we feel enlightened self-interest is very, very hard to come by. The self-interest part is very hard to come by because we want to believe that whatever is better for America is better for us. I think we are living in a moment where it is not clear that those two things always go together. And so we need to be judicious. We need to think about with whom are we allying ourselves? How are we maintaining our values within those alliances? And what is worth prioritizing? What is worth prioritizing? And I would argue that if we remember who we are, which is that we are the Jewish people first, we will be willing to sacrifice sometimes and make alliances that are a little uneasy in order to protect ourselves, in order to protect our people. I think it's essential. And I want to pause there and again, invite people to listen into the conversations with people to the left of me and to the right of me on our conversations in texting to go really deep on the practical level on all of this. But this is by way of introduction. So thank you very much. And I'd love to hear questions or comments.
Elana, thank you. I'm going to draw a little bit from the questions that have shown up in the chat. How do you address the danger of being tokenized as a Jew by being in the spaces that have commandeered anti-Jewish positions on top of their usual advocacy, which then actively works counter to your values and your Jewish values?
Yeah, so I personally think that if I am strengthening a movement, if I'm strengthening anti-Zionism, I'll just say, if I'm strengthening anti-Zionism by my participation, I will not participate. If there is a way for me to be actively vocal about my support for pro-democracy work, but my anti-Zionism, then that can give me an opportunity to stay. But I have to be able to be vocal. I have to be able to be loud about it. And this is what troubled me very much about the Lander-Mamdani team up. I think Lander is strengthening Mamdani. He's strengthening an anti-Zionist force in a very serious way. And he is not actually engaging the fact that that is what's happening here. Instead, it's being whitewashed as Jews and Muslims can get along.
Thanks. Here's another one. How long can a transactional alliance last before it becomes problematic? When do we say enough is enough? Our hands are too dirty, and we make the decision to exit the alliance.
Yeah, so I stand by, even today, even after Iran, I still wouldn't have voted for Donald Trump. I still wouldn't have voted for Donald Trump. I don't know how the salvation would have come and how it went. For me, it's a bridge too far. And that's not even about the length of the alliance. It's about the danger. It's just about the danger. But to me, and people can feel free to disagree with me, by the way. There are plenty of people who have spent the last 2 weeks in Israel who now have totally changed their tune. I get it. And I get why, we had this talk before. You can see the talk before the election. I know why a lot of people voted for Trump from the pro-Israel community. I get it. I think that the question of length, we have to consciously be measuring the dangers on each side, right? Meaning the Cold War was like an immediate aftermath of World War II. Meaning a minute earlier, these people were allied together against Nazism. And then it was like, wait, no, wait. And by the way, plenty of people suffered from that collaboration. Plenty of people suffered from that collaboration. So I'm not sure there's a way not to get the hands dirty, but I do think that this requires a degree of continual weighing. And it's why I'm happy we have JCRCs. I'm being honest. I'm happy that we have people who this is their job, essentially, to ask this question and to be thinking about it in a consistent way. And I want to turn to experts for that.
This question is related to your text with the Rebbe and Antoninus. I'm sorry.
Antoninus, yeah.
Okay, great. Is it possible that the Rebbe did not actually see Antoninus's behavior was bad? In other words, maybe the Rebbe doesn't care about the murder of the slaves. All he cares about is what Antoninus can do for him and the Jews.
So what's really interesting? I am inclined to say that if that's the case, then the end of that Talmudic passage, where they're described as two peas in a pod, is even more damning. Because what it's saying is, you've now turned Jacob into Esau. You've now turned Jacob into Esau. It was supposed to be two nations, and now you're making it two peas in a pod. And so if that's what ended up happening, well, then we have a problem. And I also think it's a really good idea to notice that when somebody starts killing their own guards, at some point they're going to try to kill your friends too, right? Which is exactly what happens. He wants to put Hanina Bar Chama in a dangerous situation, right? Where essentially he's also in mortal danger, right? So Rebbe gets him out of it, but for that not to be an aha moment, very damning. I think it's very damning.
How important a priority is preserving democracy in the U.S. and in Israel to the survival of the Jewish people?
So I think that's a really great question. I think I would, I think because democracy has been essential for the thriving of Jews, both in America and in Israel for the last, choose centuries or choose decades, I think it's essential. I think it's essential. Now, does that mean that there weren't other times where Jews were safe for a time without democracy? Sure. And, my colleague Flora Casson probably has more interesting things to say on this because she studies the modern period. I'd be curious if we could just get Flora like on my shoulder and she could tell you what she thinks. But to my mind, I mean, this is the reason why I'm actually studying religious approaches to democracy because, it expanded from religious Zionist approaches to just religious Jewish approaches, because I do think that this is a time where we have to strengthen democracy. By the way, it's not just for us. It's also because it's the most non-violent form of government that we've figured out up till now. At least liberal democracy is. So you have to see that and not just poo-poo it, right? And which is why I'm in the resist and lobby camp at the same time. It would be much easier to just choose one.
Could you help me sort out my allegiance to the international feminist organizations whose response to October 7th has been so very disappointing? And also, how do we respond to allies who have disappointed us in general?
Yeah, so I think, and this is something that Jacob Feinspan and I are going to talk about on the first episode, but I think one of the things that's important to consider is, have you had a conversation with them? Have you actually had a one-on-one conversation with them and said, hey, you really disappointed me here. You really left me out there, and give them the opportunity to actually see how it is that you feel, right? We're shocked, but do we always talk? Now, that being the case, fool me once, shame on you. Fool me twice, shame on me. I would say more like fool me 5 or 6 times, because sometimes it takes a while for people to get it. It does take a while for people to get it. And I do think that at a certain point, you essentially say, we're gonna have a Jewish feminist organization that's gonna be focused, totally inclusive for anybody who wants to come. And we recognize that we can't find space where you are anymore. But we have to remember, we also need some of those transactional alliances. We do. So how do we figure out how to recognize we've been abandoned and there are certain things we need to get done? Does it mean going back into some of those relationships with more of a memorandum of understanding, with a little bit more of a, these are my red lines, with a little bit more of, if you want me here, you're going to need to do X, Y, and Z, right? These are things that we can't just be floating on an island. We can't just be floating on an island, but it takes a lot of work to crawl our way back to where we think we were before this. And it may not work.
Can you apply some of this thinking to alliances and relationships within the Jewish community?
Yes,
Please.
yes, I can. I I think it's terrible. I think it's terrible what we're doing to ourselves. We need to be able to relate to and be able to embrace Jews who think differently than we do. It doesn't mean you need to be on my board, but it does mean you're allowed to be at my Shabbating. It doesn't mean that my mission statement now looks like your mission statement, but it does mean we're allowed to pray together in the same place, right? There will be places where, yeah, for transactional reasons, or even, this is the funny thing about transaction, even utility often has a value that's underlying it, right? Meaning, why is it that we want to get X done? Because there's a value that we share, right? Aristotle makes it seem like, well, utility has no values involved in it, right? Of course, there's something, but there's something that's limited there. And there's honesty to that limitation, right? And I think there's something we need to get better at there in terms of drawing our boundaries and when we're able to be porous about those boundaries and when we're not able to be porous about those boundaries.
What is simple language or talking point to use with transactional allies when you support one aspect of a cause but not anti-Zionist beliefs?
Yeah, so I actually think it's very important to just say, look, I'm Zionist. I'm not gonna uh, couch that in any way. I'm not going to couch that in any public way. I'm not going to couch that in any private way. If you still want to work with me or with us, let's work together, but I can't be part of a campaign that's including something anti-Zionist. So if you're doing a campaign that includes me, we can figure out a campaign that's not going to go in that direction. But again, I'm curious what practitioners would say, how they have navigated this, because they are navigating this. And they've been navigating this for years already. And hiding what my actual values are so that I hope you don't see it, that only leads to problems down the line. It only leads to problems down the line.
Who are your allies who represent friendships based on the good or non-transactional alliances?
I actually think I don't love even calling that third category allies. I think that third category is home. I think that third category are the people who I like really share it all with. That's not alliances, it's not political alliances. It's my people, right? And that's why, Tammy, it's hard to say, well, even some of the Jews don't feel like my people, right?
Mm.
Yeah, it's possible that my alliances with some other Jews are not that third type in the same way. There's something else. There's something else. So yeah, that wasn't a pun. That's really what I think.
Okay. What about Netanyahu's alliance with Kahanists and violent settlers? all good to invite to Shabbat dinner?
Oh gosh.
I
Oh
know,
gosh.
tough one.
So no, so I actually think this is very important. This
Yeah.
is the ethics of transactional allyship. The answer to me is no. The answer to me is no. The danger is too great. Strengthening it is too much. It's too dangerous. Right. So I choose to make a line, not because I don't believe in transactional alliances, but I think this one, the dangers outweigh the benefits. Right. Like that's a real decision. I mean, why did Chamberlain decide? Chamberlain's not dumb. Why did Chamberlain decide go for appeasement? He's not dumb. Right. So obviously people were tired from World War One, and whoever's a history buff on here, you could tell me a million other problems, the economy, blah, blah. He also was worried about the Soviets. So he said, okay, I'll ally with Hitler, and then the Soviets, I won't have to worry about the Soviets. And Churchill said, are you out of your mind? I'm worried about Hitler. Soviets, they're not my problem right now. Right. And what they were doing is they were weighing, right? So to my mind, if you're going to do an ethics of transactionalism, it doesn't absolve you of figuring out what your lines are. But if everything is a boundary, then we have a problem, because we're living in a time where we actually need to have allies in multiple places. And we're not going to agree with all of them. But sure, pluralism, tolerance, deviance. We talk about this all the time at Harvard. What are the things that we tolerate but we disagree with? And what are the things where we say, no, this is too dangerous. We can't do this. This is too dangerous. Ethics of transactionalism doesn't mean you don't think about that. And it doesn't mean that you don't, if you're in a real emergency situation, then you get your hands dirty and you do what you can to make up for it afterwards. I just hope we are in very few of those types of situations. Maybe I'll end there.
Amen.